I've always been a fan of escaping into nature, that feeling of peace that you can only find away from the noise of the city. But something changes when you find yourself alone, surrounded by silence, in a secluded cabin in the middle of nowhere. At first, it seems like a liberation, but as night falls and shadows start to stretch, you begin to notice details: a creak in the wooden floor, a whisper that seems to come from nowhere and yet resonates in your mind. It's at that moment when you realize that what began as a peaceful adventure can quickly transform into a terrifying experience. Today, I want to take you on a different journey. It won't be a relaxing walk through the forest or a weekend getaway in search of disconnection. Today, we're going to delve into the darkness, uncovering what really happens in those remote cabins, where horror and mystery seem to cling to every corner. I can't promise we'll finish this journey without a chill, or that you won't look over your shoulder the next time you hear a strange sound in the night. But I can promise that these stories, based on real events, will keep you on edge, with your eyes wide open, even as you try to sleep tonight. These aren't the typical legends told around a campfire to scare friends. No, what we're going to explore today are true accounts, documented incidents that occurred in remote cabins where horror and the inexplicable left an indelible mark. Maybe after hearing these stories, you'll think twice before planning your next cabin getaway. So, I invite you to stay with me as we explore 4 chilling tales of cabins that will leave you breathless. I assure you that by the end of this video, something inside you will have changed, a small part that will never feel completely safe again when the silence of the night falls around you. Ready for this journey? Then, turn off the lights, settle in, and let yourself be carried away by the shadows lurking within the walls of these forgotten cabins. The Hansen Family Cabin. I remember perfectly the first time I heard about the Hansen Family Cabin. It was a cold night, the kind where the wind lashes against the windows and makes you feel as if something, or someone, is lurking in the darkness. A close friend, an avid lover of trips to remote places, told me about his experience. He had spent a few days in a secluded cabin in the woods of Minnesota, but what began as a quiet getaway with friends turned into an experience that none of those present would ever forget. According to him, the cabin had belonged to the Hansen family, a couple with 3 children who lived there during the 1970s. At first, the Hansens were attracted to the idea of escaping city life, wanting to raise their children in a peaceful and natural setting. But what they didn't know was that the place where they built their home harbored a dark history. Some locals spoke of disappearances, unexplained accidents, and a presence that, according to rumors, lurked around the edge of the forest. The Hansens, like many before them, dismissed these warnings. What began as a dream life soon turned into a nightmare. The first months passed peacefully, but it was in the winter of the second year when everything began to change. One night, while the family was having dinner, the 3 children mentioned something unsettling. They had all seen, on different occasions, a dark figure lurking near the cabin. At first, the parents thought it was just the children's imagination. After all, they were in the woods, and the mind can play tricks on you when the sun goes down. But the descriptions of the figure matched too closely. A tall, faceless shadow watching from a distance. Always there, but never coming close enough. That same week, they started hearing noises on the roof at night, as if someone was walking on top of the cabin, but whenever the father went outside to check, he found nothing. The footprints in the snow around the house didn't seem human. They were too large, but they didn't belong to any known animal in the area. The sounds intensified. Not only on the roof, but also inside the cabin. Doors closing by themselves, whispers in the hallways, and, most disturbing of all, the sound of a child's laughter coming from upstairs, even when the children were asleep. My friend described the story with such detail that, even though I was a skeptic, I couldn't help but feel a shiver run down my spine. He told me that despite the strange occurrences, the Hansen family decided to stay. Maybe they thought they could ignore what was happening, or maybe they were afraid of what might happen if they tried to leave. It was around this time that the disappearances began. The first to go missing was the youngest daughter, Emily. One morning, when the Hansens woke up, she was simply gone. They searched the entire cabin, checked the surroundings, but there was no trace of her. The snow, which had fallen during the night, showed no footprints, as if the earth had swallowed her. Desperate, the Hansens sought help from locals, who, though reluctant, joined the search. However, most avoided getting close to the cabin, as if something about the place repelled or frightened them. Days passed with no sign of Emily. The family began to fall apart. The father, increasingly paranoid, spent his nights vigilantly watching the cabin, armed and on edge. The mother, consumed by despair, began to have visions of her daughter in the mirrors of the house, always standing, staring at her from the other side, but not saying a word. What disturbed me most about this story was what happened the day the Hansens finally decided to leave the cabin. It occurred months after Emily's disappearance, when the strange occurrences had become unbearable. The night before they were to leave, the mother heard a loud knock on the front door. When she opened it, she found no one, but on the ground in front of the entrance was a small doll. A doll that had belonged to her missing daughter. Terrified, she screamed for her husband, but when he arrived, the doll was already gone. They thought it was a hallucination caused by stress, but what happened next made it clear that it wasn't. The next day, as the family was loading their things into the car, the father went up to the attic one last time to make sure they weren't leaving anything behind. What he found there left him frozen. On the floor, in the middle of the attic, was the doll, perfectly placed, as if someone had deliberately left it there. That was all it took. He ran out of the cabin, grabbed his wife and child, and left, vowing never to return. The strange thing about this story is that, although the family left, the happenings at the Hansen cabin didn't end. Years later, other occupants reported similar phenomena: shadows at night, unexplained noises, and, most unsettling of all, the reappearance of the same doll, always in the attic, as if it were waiting for something or someone. The cabin has remained unoccupied since then, but rumors persist. Some believe that Emily's spirit still wanders the place, trapped between this world and the next. Others think that something darker lurks in the woods surrounding the house, an ancient presence that hasn't finished its work. And though this is just one of many stories circulating about remote cabins, it makes you wonder, what really happens in those isolated places? Is it just our imagination playing tricks on us, or is there something beyond, something watching us from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself? Perhaps, the next time you think about booking a cabin to escape the daily grind, you'll remember the Hansen story and wonder if you'll truly be alone. The shelter in the Appalachians. I wasn't looking for another disturbing story when I came across the tale of the shelter in the Appalachians, but sometimes stories find you. One afternoon, while browsing a hiking forum, I noticed a conversation about places where hikers felt a presence they couldn't explain. Among the comments, one mention stood out repeatedly: a shelter somewhere lost in the Appalachians. Apparently, everyone who spent the night there ended up feeling the same unsettling sense of not being alone. One user shared a story that resonated more than the others. It was about a shelter located in a remote part of the Appalachians, accessible only after several days of hiking. It's not one of those luxurious shelters with electricity and running water. No. It's more of a small, rustic wooden cabin, barely visible among the dense trees. Hikers usually use it for rest, but after hearing this story, I can't help but wonder if anyone in their right mind would want to spend the night there. This story is told by a man named Tom, an experienced hiker who decided to take a week-long trek through the Appalachians alone. He had already spent 3 days when he arrived at this shelter. It was the kind of place you expect to find deep in the mountains, simple, cozy, and isolated enough that you could feel like you were the only human being for miles around. Or at least, that's what Tom thought. The first sign that something was wrong was the silence. Not the typical forest silence, filled with small sounds if you stopped to listen, but an absolute, unnatural silence. There were no birds, no whisper of the wind through the leaves. Nothing. Tom didn't think much of it at first. He was tired after hiking all day and just wanted to rest. He lit a small fire in front of the shelter, prepared some food, and sat down to enjoy the stillness, but that sense of being completely alone began to feel less like a blessing and more like a curse. As he ate, he started to notice something strange around the shelter. At a distance, among the trees, there was something. Something that hadn't been there before. A dark, unmoving shape. Tom thought it might just be a tree or a rock he hadn't noticed before, but the unease he felt at that moment made him question that assumption. Though he tried to ignore it, the feeling of being watched was too strong. He went to bed early that night, but sleep did not come easily. The wind had started to blow, making the old timbers of the shelter creak. At every small noise, Tom woke up with his heart racing. That's when he heard it for the first time, footsteps. At first, he thought it was his imagination. But the footsteps were getting closer, stopping just outside the cabin. Afraid to move, he held his breath, hoping to hear something more. But everything remained silent. A silence even heavier than before. That night, Tom didn't dare leave the shelter. He spent hours lying in his sleeping bag, listening to every creak, every whisper of the wind, wondering if there was really someone outside or if it was all in his head. The next morning, he set out determined to continue his journey and get away from that place as quickly as possible. But what he found outside left him frozen. On the ground, in front of the shelter's entrance, were footprints. Footprints that weren't his. The most disturbing thing was that they seemed to circle the shelter, as if someone had been walking around it during the night. There were no signs that anyone else had been in the area. Tom checked the surroundings, but the footprints vanished a few meters away. He decided it was time to leave. He quickly packed his things and set off. But as he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. He turned his head every few minutes, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, paranoia consumed him. In the middle of the day, when he stopped to rest, he heard those footsteps again. This time, he was not at the shelter but in the middle of the forest. He turned quickly, but no one was there. The forest, once again, was immersed in that strange silence. And then he saw it. In the distance, barely visible among the trees, was that same figure he had seen the night before. Motionless. Shadow among shadows. Tom wasn't the type to scare easily, but something about that figure filled him with an irrational terror. He gathered his things and hurried away. But no matter how fast he walked, he always felt that something, or someone, was following closely behind. The trees seemed closer, the air denser. The forest itself seemed to be conspiring against him, as if it didn't want to let him go. Finally, as evening fell, he reached a small clearing where he decided to camp. The sun was setting, and despite everything, he was exhausted. But that night was no different from the last. The footsteps returned. This time closer, more persistent. And then, at the darkest point of the night, when everything was in complete silence, a child's voice called to him from the forest. Tom described it as the most terrifying sound he had ever heard. It was a weak, brittle voice, almost as if the child was about to cry. "Help me," it said, over and over. But no matter how many times Tom asked, "Where are you?" the response was always the same, "Help me." Not daring to venture into the forest, Tom turned on his flashlight and pointed it toward the trees, but saw nothing. The voice continued until dawn, finally fading with the morning light. That morning, Tom packed everything he had and decided to end his journey. No matter how beautiful the landscape was, something in those woods was hunting him, and he wasn't staying to find out what it was. He reached the nearest town and stayed in a hotel, but the feeling of being watched followed him there. Days later, as he shared his story on the forum, other hikers began to share similar experiences in the same area. Some claimed to have seen a tall man with his face covered by a hood, following them at a cautious distance for miles. Others spoke of a strange rustling in the trees, as if someone or something huge was climbing them. But the most unsettling was the story of the child's voice. Apparently, more than one had heard it, always asking for help but never showing itself. Although Tom never returned to the Appalachians, he continues to tell this story with the same unease in his voice, as if he relives those moments every time he recounts them. Sometimes, when I'm alone in nature, I can't help but think about his experience, wondering if there's really something in those woods we don't understand. Something ancient, something lurking in the shadows, waiting for someone to hear it and, perhaps, follow it. It's curious how the most beautiful places can hide the darkest stories. The summer retreat in Canada. I remember the first time I heard about the summer retreat in Canada was during a casual conversation in a small cafe in Vancouver. A group of friends was discussing the most peaceful and secluded places to disconnect from the world, but one of them, a man who had barely spoken throughout the chat, suddenly mentioned a place that changed the tone of the conversation completely. His voice was almost a whisper when he said, "The summer retreat." I hadn't heard of this place before, but the way everyone else at the table fell silent made me feel there was something strange, something different about it. It wasn't long before I asked more about it, and what I discovered left me with a strange sense of unease. According to the story, this retreat is hidden deep in the Canadian woods, on the shores of a lake that rarely appears on maps. It used to be a family retreat, an idyllic cabin where travelers would go to enjoy the peace of the forest, the beauty of nature, and the silence that only such a remote spot can offer. But over time, that serenity began to twist into something much darker. One of the most recurring stories about the retreat is that of a family who decided to spend their summer vacation there. It was a perfect place, the kind of spot that seemed straight out of a postcard, crystal clear waters, a small dock where the children could fish, and a cozy cabin made of pine wood that exuded that characteristic rustic smell. It was paradise, at least during the day. The first night, something changed. The parents, the children, all of them noticed that the atmosphere of the retreat was different once night fell. Though they had spent the day under the sun, swimming in the lake and exploring the woods, when darkness took over the sky, the atmosphere became heavy, as if the air had suddenly thickened. There was no wind, no usual rustling of the branches. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The eldest son was the first to mention it, albeit jokingly. He said he didn't like the feeling of being on the dock after the sun went down. He mentioned that when he looked at the water, he swore he saw something beneath the surface. At first, everyone laughed it off and dismissed it as an attempt to scare his younger siblings, but when the mother went to the dock shortly afterward to retrieve some forgotten towels, she felt the same. She stopped at the edge of the dock and, for some inexplicable reason, found herself staring at the water. The lake was completely still, without a single wave, but she felt as though something was watching her from the depths. It was an almost tangible sensation, as if invisible eyes were observing her. She hurried back to the cabin, not wanting to alarm the others. The next day, things felt normal again. The family spent the day fishing, playing in the water, and exploring the surroundings. However, whenever anyone approached the dock, there was a noticeable reluctance, as if an invisible force was discouraging them from staying too long. And so, night fell over the retreat once again. It was during that second night when things escalated. The mother woke up around 3 in the morning, that strange hour filled with mystery. She was sure she had heard something outside, a noise that didn't match the natural sounds of the forest. She got up, her heart pounding, and walked to the window that faced the lake. At first, she saw nothing, just the darkness of the water and the faint light of the moon reflecting on its surface. But then, something caught her attention. Across the lake, on the opposite shore, was a figure. It wasn't moving, but its presence was unmistakable. At that distance, it was hard to make out details, but the silhouette looked human. It could have been just a tree, she thought, or a shadow, but then the figure began to walk, slowly, along the shore, approaching the dock. She wanted to wake her husband, but she was paralyzed by a mix of curiosity and fear. It was as if part of her needed to see what would happen next. The figure continued to approach, getting closer and closer, until it reached the edge of the dock, right where the mother had been the previous day. The figure stopped there, still, looking out over the water, and then, without warning, it leapt into the lake. The water made no sound, no splashes. The figure simply vanished beneath the surface, as if the lake had swallowed it. The mother stepped away from the window, finally freed from that strange trance, and woke her husband. She told him what she had seen, but when they both looked again, there was nothing. The next morning, the family decided to leave. They could no longer ignore the discomfort surrounding them, and the eldest son confessed that he had had nightmares about the lake, where something was trying to drag him underwater. They packed up quickly and, when they got in the car, they didn't look back. The story of this family spread, and others who had visited the retreat began to share similar experiences. Some claimed to have seen the same figure across the lake, always approaching but never showing its face. Others reported hearing whispers coming from the water at night, voices calling from the depths. And then there were those who said they had seen strange lights under the water, as if something was igniting at the bottom of the lake, waiting to be released. The retreat, once an idyllic getaway, began to be avoided by travelers. Eventually, the owners closed it down, and the place fell into abandonment. Nowadays, few people dare to venture to that part of the forest. Those who do say that silence is the first thing they notice. There are no bird songs, no natural sounds. Only that oppressive silence, as if the entire place is waiting, watching, from the shadows. Every time I think about that lake, about the figure disappearing beneath its waters, I can't help but feel a shiver down my spine. It's as if those Canadian woods hide secrets that are not meant to be uncovered. Yet, the curiosity always lingers. What did that mother see that night? What lies at the bottom of the lake that has disturbed so many people? Perhaps we may never know, or maybe there's something still waiting to be discovered. The miner's cabin. I remember the first time I heard about the miner's cabin. It was a story circulating among experienced hikers and adventure seekers, the kind of tale told around a campfire when the wind blows strong and the flames cast eerie shadows on nearby trees. The cabin, located in the remote mountains of Colorado, was built during the gold rush at the end of the 19th century, an improvised refuge for miners who, tired and desperate, sought their fortune in those inhospitable lands. But what they found was something entirely different. I ventured there one autumn afternoon. The foliage colors were vibrant, but there was something in the air, something dense and almost suffocating, that made me feel uneasy from the start. I had read some accounts about the cabin, but they were vague and filled with contradictions. Some said that the miners who built it never found gold and vanished without a trace. Others spoke of strange lights in the forest, of voices calling from the depths of the mountains. I, always curious and with a taste for the mysterious, couldn't resist the temptation to discover it for myself. The cabin was situated in a part of the forest where the vegetation was particularly dense. It barely stood out among the trees, with its wooden structure worn by time and the elements. As I approached, I felt the atmosphere change, as if the wind itself ceased in respect for the place. I stood in front of the door, which hung slightly from a rusted hinge, and peered inside. The interior was simple, just a fireplace, a broken table, and some abandoned utensils. But what caught my attention the most was an inscription carved into the wall. The words, barely visible under the dirt and mold, read, "Do not stay after midnight." I felt a chill run down my spine. It was just a warning, probably made by someone wanting to scare future visitors, but there was something about that phrase that left me unsettled. I decided to ignore it, attributing it to local legends, and set out to explore further. The first couple of hours were relatively calm. I sat near the fireplace, which, although extinguished, seemed to emit a faint warmth. There was something oddly comforting about the cabin, despite its dilapidated appearance. But as the sun began to set behind the mountains, the atmosphere changed again. The air grew colder, and the silence, which had seemed peaceful before, began to feel oppressive, as if the forest was holding its breath. That's when I heard it for the first time, a whisper, barely perceptible, coming from somewhere outside the cabin. I stood still, trying to listen better, but the sound vanished as quickly as it had come. I told myself it was just the wind among the trees, but I knew it wasn't. There was something out there, something I couldn't see but felt clearly. I decided to stay inside the cabin when night fell, not because I wanted to challenge the warning carved into the wall, but because, deep down, I wanted to understand what was really happening in that place. I turned on a lantern and set it on the broken table while pulling out my notebook, ready to record anything strange that might occur. A couple of hours passed without incident, but just as the clock struck 11:30, the real phenomena began. The first sign that something was wrong was the feeling that I was not alone. I saw no one and heard no footsteps, but the air inside the cabin grew heavy, almost suffocating. I felt a presence, something or someone watching me from the shadows. My lantern, which had been casting a steady light in the small space, began to flicker. That's when I heard the sound of footsteps in the snow. They were slow, as if someone was approaching cautiously. I went outside to see if there was any animal lurking, but there was nothing. Nothing, except for fresh footprints extending from the edge of the forest to the cabin door, but ending abruptly, as if the person who made them had vanished into the air. I returned to the cabin with my heart racing. The footprints, strange as they were, didn't scare me as much as what I felt inside that place. With each passing minute, the sensation of being watched intensified. And then, at exactly midnight, it happened. The fireplace, which had been completely extinguished since I arrived, suddenly roared to life, filling the cabin with stifling heat. I stood frozen, watching the flames dance without a visible source of fuel. At that moment, I heard it again, the whisper, but this time much clearer. "Leave now," the voice said, soft but insistent. I looked around, trying to find where it was coming from, but there was no one. The shadows of the cabin seemed to come alive in the firelight, stretching and twisting into impossible shapes. My instinct told me to run, to leave immediately, but something kept me there, as if I needed to know more. That's when I saw the figure. It was tall, taller than any person should be, and it stood in the darkest corner of the cabin. I couldn't make out its face, but its eyes glowed with an unnatural intensity. I stood paralyzed for what seemed like hours, but must have been only seconds. The figure did not move, only watched me, and then, with a sudden motion, the flames in the fireplace went out, plunging me into total darkness. I don't know how I found the courage to run out of the cabin, but I did. I raced through the forest, not looking back, feeling that something was following me in the darkness. I didn't stop until I reached the clearing where I had left my car. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath, the silence of the forest returned, but this time, I felt relieved by it. I never returned to that cabin, and to this day, I can't explain what I experienced there. But one thing is certain, the legends about the miner's cabin are not just tales to scare travelers. Something else inhabits that place, something ancient and malevolent. And while I can't say for sure what it is, I know that the warning carved into the wall was not just a joke. If you ever find that refuge in the mountains, my advice is simple: do not stay after midnight. We have reached the end of this journey, a journey through stories that have not only quickened our hearts, but also left us with unanswered questions. As I reflect on what we've experienced together, I can't help but feel a mix of emotions: fascination, fear, and of course, that curiosity that keeps you awake in bed, wondering what might be lurking in the shadows. Throughout this tale, we have walked down dark paths and delved into the mysteries of cabins that, while appearing to be simple shelters in the midst of nature, hold terrifying secrets. From the Hansen family's cabin, where a single decision changed everyone's lives forever, to the refuge in the Appalachians, where nature itself seems to turn against visitors. We have felt the glacial cold of the Canadian cabin and the visceral terror of being watched from the shadows in the miner's cabin. Each of these stories has been a reminder of the unknown, of what we cannot entirely control or understand. But beyond the scares and the inexplicable experiences, there is something that has always intrigued me about these tales. It's not just the fear that attracts us, but the need to seek an answer. What lies behind these phenomena? Are they manifestations of our imagination, or is there something beyond what we can see and touch? Over the centuries, legends of haunted houses, cursed cabins, and places where the rules of the world seem to distort have persisted, fueled by the stories of those brave, or foolish, enough to venture into the unknown. And here's where I want to ask you an important question: what do you think lies behind these stories? Is there truly something supernatural lurking in these remote places, or is it our minds that weave these tales from the deepest fears we carry within? Each of these stories can be interpreted in different ways. Some people choose to believe in ghosts and presences that inhabit the forgotten corners of the world, while others prefer a more logical explanation. But at the end of the day, what makes us return to these stories time and again? What drives us to turn on the light while listening to such tales, even though we know there is probably nothing out there? Personally, I think what's most fascinating about horror stories is how they connect us with a part of ourselves that we rarely let others see. That dark corner of our psyche that enjoys confronting the unknown, even if it's only from the safety of a story told or a video on a screen. We like feeling fear, but we also like feeling that, somehow, we can overcome it. And perhaps that's the true reward of this entire journey, discovering not only the mysteries lurking in abandoned cabins, but also what those mysteries reveal about us. So, after all these stories, after all these unsettling moments, I have one final reflection. Perhaps the cabins and shelters we've explored are not the only places where these mysteries reside. Maybe the real terror isn't in the old wooden walls or the extinguished chimneys, but in the recesses of our minds, where our deepest fears come to life. Perhaps what we've been exploring all this time isn't just ghost stories, but the stories we tell ourselves when the lights go out and we are alone. And now, I invite you to think about this. What is your own fear, your own personal horror story? Have you ever felt like something is watching you, even when you're completely alone? Have you heard unexplained noises in the middle of the night or woken up with that strange feeling that something is wrong? If so, I would love to read your experiences in the comments. Share with us that story that has kept you awake until the early hours of the morning. Because, in the end, the most terrifying thing about these stories is not just hearing them, but realizing that we all, at some point, have had our own moments of terror. That is your reward for coming this far, for diving into these tales with me. It's not just the fear we've shared, but a connection to what makes us human, the ability to imagine, to fear, and at the same time, to marvel at the unknown. So don't hesitate to leave your thoughts, your stories, or even your theories about what really happened in these cabins. What do you think that presence in the miner's cabin was? What explanation do you find for the disappearances in the Appalachians? This is the time to share, to reflect, and, why not, to continue the conversation. Because even though the video ends here, the stories always continue, in the imagination of those who listen and in the tales we tell each other. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and don't forget to leave your story. Because, after all, who knows what else might be waiting out there, in the darkness, ready to become the next tale that keeps someone awake at night.